Welcome to Zoom In, Zoom Out, your global look at news from Taiwan. I'm Alec MacDonald. Jimmy Carter, the longest living United States president, has died at the age of 100 years old. Carter served only one term in office from 1977 to 1981, but those years were marked by foreign policy decisions still felt to this day, from brokering the Camp David Accords to formally severing ties with the Republic of China. But it is decades of work out of the White House that he has become most known for globally. To learn more about the legacy of Jimmy Carter, I'm joined by Bill Stanton, a retired U.S. diplomat. He served as the director for the American Institute in Taiwan from 2009 to 2012. Following his retirement, he taught as a professor at several top Taiwanese universities. Bill, welcome and thank you very much for joining us today.
Happy to be with you.
We first want to zoom in on Carter's time as president. You actually joined the Foreign Service in 1978 while he was still president. What was that like, and can you tell us a little bit about that time?
My first assignment after junior officer training in Washington for, I guess, 6 months, I volunteered to go and welcomed the chance to go to Beirut, which was already a kind of war zone, dangerous place. When Carter came in, I welcomed that because, of course, in my college, at least my graduate school years, part of that time, Nixon was the president. And Nixon, of course, had gone through the Watergate crisis. And it was a very unpleasant period when basically our president of the United States had been forced to resign. I liked Carter because he focused on human rights, he focused on democracy, and I think he was the first president really to make that a key part of his portfolio. So my overall assessment in my early years in the Foreign Service was that, he was successful and certainly had more achievements in foreign policy than many subsequent presidents.
As someone who is in the Foreign Service, what do you think were some of President Carter's crowning foreign policy achievements?
Well, I think the three significant foreign policy decisions that he made, the Panama Canal, like it or not, the Camp David Accords, and in particular then the Taiwan Relations Act. I think, one of the important things about the U.S. is its values. And he stood up for those values, the best of our values at least. And I think that was kind of a breakthrough. I don't think previous presidents had emphasized that as much. He really believed in we had to treat other people fairly and well, which I think also accounts for his decision on Panama Canal. That it wasn't really our territory. We had basically, we'd built the canal, but it was basically a land other people were living in. And, I think that kind of sense of fairness and adhered to everything he did.
Bill, you mentioned the Camp David Accords, and you're actually serving in the region at the time that was signed. What were the tensions and discussions like inside the Foreign Service at that time, and how did that impact the region?
I really welcome the Camp David Accords, which I think is one of the great achievements of Carter because, there's been lasting peace, at least in that part of the Middle East, between Israel and Egypt over all these years. It was a reassuring move in the Middle East at a time when things were increasingly uncertain and got worse as we saw increasing terrorist attacks over time, over my years in the Foreign Service. Near the end of the Carter administration, there was, of course, the attack on the U.S. Embassy, the taking of hostages, and all that. And in comparison, the solution that had been worked out between Israel and Egypt seemed like the right way to go. So I think, is the whole idea of being a peacemaker rather than just a participant in conflict.
Let's move to Asia, where President Carter is most known for severing ties with the Republic of China. How did this impact the region and the world at that time?
Well, I think those of us who recognized at that time the big threat was not China, the big threat was Russia. And it was perceived, I think, by everyone that it was a good strategic move to try to stabilize the relationship um, with the Chinese. And the Chinese were also not that big of a threat at that time. Economically, they were not in great shape. They needed trade with the United States. And then, of course, there was criticism of it, though, and it continues to be. It recognized, in effect, communist China. But on the other hand, but we continued to also acknowledge um, Taiwan. And I think it was it was conclusion, a way of dealing with the issue that's held its own over time and over the years. It was only later when I went to China um, that I realized, in a way, that I thought uh, Taiwan, the Taiwan Relations Act, of course, was our catechism for the relationship with China. And though he was criticized for recognizing, Carter was criticized for recognizing China, in fact, what was important was subsequently coming to a way of getting around our continuing disagreement on the status of Taiwan was the Taiwan Relations Act.
What might have happened if that in 79 Carter had not made the decision to move forward with recognizing the PRC, and that there was that the United States continued to recognize the ROC at that time?
There was an agreement about, in effect, continuing U.S. arms sales um, for Taiwan. And I think if we had just abandoned Taiwan, particularly at a time when it was under authoritarian governments, I think the chances for a conflict would have greatly increased. And you know, often in diplomacy, the best you can do is to defer conflicts and to defer problems and to buy time. And I think, in effect, we did that. Looking back, it had been really a great success for the relationship. And it was a sort of a foundation stone of the relationship as it then existed with Taiwan.
That's actually a great place to zoom out to talk about the Taiwan Relations Act, which is now 45 years old. How has that impacted the world, and especially focusing on right now, how that is impacting and carrying U.S. and Taiwan relations?
To this day, of course, the Chinese are very upset and have always tried to get us to abandon the Taiwan Relations Act. But I think it's continued to prove fruitful for us as a way of trying to resolve, or at least to put in abeyance, a very difficult issue for the United States and for all parties concerned. And the proof of that is that Taiwan flourished under the Taiwan Relations Act. And as it moved thereafter to more democracy and freedom, became more economically successful, and indeed then became the world leader in chips. Everybody could look back and say, um, Carter made a good decision back then. It was not only the Taiwan Relations Act, but also, how we interpreted it. That basically allowed us to continue to have a strong relationship with Taiwan, with the people of Taiwan, to have a strong economic relationship with Taiwan, but also not to back down in the face of Chinese pressures. We've continued to abide by our side of the agreement by saying, we would acknowledge the Chinese position, but that didn't mean we would accept it. We would acknowledge the Chinese position that there's one China, but that didn't mean that was our position. We would be much more ambiguous about it, in effect. So it was a safeguard, a railing, both with China but also with Taiwan. And I think that allowed us to live with both sides and for the relationship with both sides to, get the best it could be.
You've interacted with people in China and in Taiwan. In your conversations there, what did people think about Carter?
Well, I don't think either side was all that much in love with him. I think over time, as Taiwan became more democratic, I think they became very much more favorable in their view of Carter and what he had done. He supported human rights, and he did the best he could in terms of the relationship with Taiwan. I think China, the view remains much more negative. I think going back, Mao was very unhappy. Um, Deng Xiaoping was unhappy. Surely Xi Jinping is unhappy and would like to totally revise how we manage the relationship.
So we can't really finish talking about Carter without touching on his humanitarian aid work and also his focus on democracy and justice. What do you think fueled that in Carter?
I think there was a deep sense of disappointment that he hadn't been able to continue in the direction he wanted to go. And I think he's somebody who always wanted to do more and, to contribute as much as he could. I mean, here's a guy who went to West Point. He was a nuclear engineer. He was an author. He was a governor. He was a representative before that. He was driven. He was very ambitious, but he was ambitious also in the way that he felt there were things he could do and that he wanted to do, and that would be good things to do for the United States, but for other countries. He was always interested, for example, in segregation. He was interested in helping the poor. And he realized there were huge humanitarian problems around the world.
In a sentence, what do you believe is the legacy that Jimmy Carter has left with our world?
I think his biggest legacy may have been his overall concern for human rights, which I think was he gave that more emphasis than any previous or even subsequent president, I think. And nowadays, I'm sure if you go to the Foreign Service School, and one of the things that they emphasize is human rights. Also, we didn't talk about it, but his emphasis on denuclearization, his efforts with the SALT II talks that failed, but his efforts to try to stop growing buildup of nuclear weapons. But the legacy is he identified the United States more closely with the cause for human rights, and that it's something we should all be concerned about.
Bill, thank you very much for sharing with us today.
Thank you.
This has been Zoom In, Zoom Out. For more stories from TaiwanPlus News, follow us on social media. Thank you very much for joining, and we'll see you next time.
We bring you stories from Taiwan.
Every day of the week.
Our reporters travel the nation.
Exploring the issues that matter to you.
News from here in Taiwan and around the world.
What's up, Taiwan? On TaiwanPlus.